these living standards are going to keep falling under this ridiculous policy we've got. So, just yesterday, that's the little snippet on the left. The Albanese government announced that it's going to cut funding for infrastructure projects and cut infrastructure projects. It's basically going to delay or axe $33 billion worth of projects. And this is coming at the same time as it's obviously running the biggest population growth / immigration program in the nation's history. So, we need infrastructure more now than ever if we're going to keep up with this huge population growth. And yet you've got the federal government planning to cut it. So all that means is you're going to get more congestion, which means lower living standards. At the same time, just today, it was announced by the Bureau of Meteorology that basically we're going to head into a period of El Nino, which is the opposite of what we had the last 3 years, which means we're going to have a hot, dry summer and probably years of hot, dry weather, the reverse of what we had 3 years. And it was only 4 years ago, as we headed into the Black Saturday fires, that Sydney's water supply was tracking at around 20%. After about a 4-year period of drought conditions. Well, what's going to happen next time, say in 4 years' time, when the population has grown by millions under this extreme immigration policy? What do you think is going to happen to the water supply? And what's going to happen to the water supply in 40 years when the intergeneration report says we're going to grow by 14.2 million people? We're going to add a Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Adelaide in 40 years. According to the intergeneration report. What are we going to do then with climate change and more droughts and that sort of stuff? Where are we going to get the water from? The whole thing doesn't add up. And then the other question is, how are we going to achieve net zero? So the government's committed to achieving net zero by 2050. Apart from the fact that it's never going to happen anyway, because it's a bit of a farce, but how are we going to achieve this net zero when the population is predicted to rise by over 50% over that 40-year period? So we're going to have 14.2 million extra consumers of energy, extra consumers, creating waste, more cars, more white goods, more electric, more TVs and everything. All this stuff requires energy, requires resources, going to create emissions. How are we going to achieve this mythical net zero? It's an absolute farce. It's impossible. And finally, the graphic on the right comes from the Australian State of the Environment report. Now, what that is, that's released every 5 years, and that's basically the intergenerational report for the environment. And what that said is that that population growth has a very high impact on the environment. That's this right here. It's got the biggest impact. Well, of course it does. If you're going to have more people, you're going to have to do more land clearing. You're going to have more waste. You're going to have more resource use. You're going to have more pollution, all this sort of stuff. How are we going to safeguard the environment with an extra 14.2 million people in 40 years, as predicted by the intergeneration report? Like, these are all, things that the federal government never considers. The Australian Treasury never considers when it runs these ridiculously large immigration programs. And, what it basically means is that we're going to have lower living standards. We're all going to see it in the housing market. Like, our kids and grandkids are not going to be living in detached houses. Most of them aren't. They're going to be living in, shoebox apartments. And they're probably, a lot of them are going to be renting instead of owning them, unlike, their parents and grandparents. This is all a direct attack on our quality of life. And the federal government is effectively doing this deliberately by running these extreme immigration levels and ensuring that demand forever outpaces supply and outpaces the economy's basically carrying capacity. It's a joke. And just one last thing, I just did some rando charts. Wasn't sure I was going to use them, but just on the whole water issue. So this chart on the right here was some estimates of the cost of different forms of water supply. And you can see that it's got one desalination plant here, the Wonthaggi one in Victoria. But basically the cost of desalination is, about 5 times as much as traditional dam water. And even water recycling is about four or so times as much as traditional dam water. So effectively, if we're going to cater to these massive population increase, we're going to have to build a whole bunch of desal plants. And what this means, and this chart here in the middle is from Infrastructure Australia 2017, and it tipped that real water prices for households are going to basically rise fourfold from 2017 up to 2067. So again, this is another attack on your quality of life. We're going to bring in all these people during climate change. You have to build a whole bunch of energy guzzling and expensive desalination plants that's going to push up water bills astronomically, which is going to obviously hurt household budgets. And how are we going to get water to, say, Western Sydney, up to 50 kilometres away from the ocean? We're going to somehow have to build these pipelines from the desal plants on the coast and pump the water uphill against gravity, uses a lot of energy to somehow, provide water to some of the fastest growing areas of Australia where a lot of the migrants go to. It doesn't work. And none of this stuff is considered by policymakers or the big Australia shills, Abel Rizvi, Liz Allen, all those people. None of these costs are considered. And it's just, it's about time we start talking about this stuff, which is, I guess, what we're doing here, Martin. I'm sorry, I'm in a very ranty mood tonight.
That's good. Keep ranting. I mean, this is important stuff, right? And it doesn't get enough of an airing because everyone's worried about, well, is inflation going to go up or down or whatever, or what's happening in China.
This is long-term stuff.
But these questions are the fundamental questions because they come actually to what sort of Australia do we want? What sort of Australia are we going to get? How big a gap is there between what we want and what we're going to get? And the truth is, it's been messed over, right? And basically, this massive population boom that we're talking about is going to reduce the living standards for everybody in the country. And it's going to make it harder for people to actually get ahead. It's going to actually force a lot of people to move further out. So if you look at where a lot of the growth in populations, it's, Western Sydney or whatever, well, which, by the way, there's no infrastructure at all out there, So what we've actually done is we've reduced the standard of living and we are accepting compromises in terms of building up higher and building smaller and all those things because housing affordability is off the scale. The point is, this isn't a happenstance. There's a series of settings and policies and strategies that have been in place for the last 20 to 30 years, which have created this monster. And yet, almost everybody in the sort of the mainstream conversation ignores it and just talks about the things that are, of more immediate impact. These are critical questions, Leith, really critical questions.
Oh, 100%. And this is why I always call immigration the everything issue, because it affects pretty much most aspects of your quality of life. It affects whether or not you can afford to live in a house or you have to live in a shoebox apartment, whether you can ever actually own a house or you're forced to rent it. It affects obviously how long you spend stuck in traffic. It impacts whether or not you can find a seat on a train or on a bus, whether or not there's, you can find a spot at a park or a sporting field, whether or not, you can water your garden because if you're lucky enough to have a garden, because there's water shortages, et cetera, et cetera. Like, it's just everything. And also you're obviously, how much smog's in the air, all sorts of stuff. And it's basically the everything issue. Yet some people don't want us to talk about it. And we should be talking about it because we've deliberately gone down the road of doing this here, the last 20 years. We went from normal, sustainable, whatever, you could easily plan for it. We could build enough houses. It was good, moderate growth. Under these sorts of net overseas migration things, in 2002, the 2002 Intergeneration Report basically forecast or projected that Australia's population would be its current size, what it is now, 26.4 million by 2050, right? That was under net overseas migration. That was assumed to be 90,000 a year, which was basically the post-war average. It was actually a little bit above the post-war average, but basically this red line. So, if we'd done this for the last 20 years, we would not hit our current population until 2050. And we wouldn't be having these housing shortages. And we wouldn't be having this, we wouldn't even be here talking about it right now. We'd just be like, yeah, it'll all be cool. Cities be growing at a gradual pace. We'd be providing enough infrastructure, all that sort of stuff. Instead, they just started to ramp it to these sorts of levels. And as a result, we've hit this population, projection from 2002, 28 years early. And now by 2050, our population, well, by 2063, our population's, tipped to be over 40 million people. And it's like, well, what are we doing here? Like, why do we have to run it so hard? Why are we doing this? It's been thrust upon us. because, you know, somehow talking about this stuff, you're not allowed to talk about it because if you talk about it, you're a racist. And that's basically the excuse. It's like, oh, you must not talk about it. And the housing crisis has nothing to do with this. It's because of, you know, poor government policy. Well, the poor government policy is doing this. Like, you know, the fact of the matter is we had the biggest ever housing construction boom ever last decade, right? We built 223,000 homes in what was it, 2016, I think it was. That was our biggest year ever of housing construction. You know, yet the federal government has said we're going to somehow magically do 1.2 million in 5 years, starting from July 1 next year. We'd only ever hit over 220,000 once in our history. And magically we're going to do 240,000 for 5 consecutive years. Come on. Who actually believes we're going to do that? Nobody. The developers don't believe it. They literally went to the AFR, property forum last week, where, you know, Nigel Slattery, who's a developer in WA, basically he tipped that we'll at best do 560,000. I think he said. So he said basically half, less than half what the 1.2 million target said. Tim Gurner, who's copping it in the neck for obviously stupid statements last week, he said that we're basically going to, you know, have our worst ever housing crisis. That's what he told the forum. Nobody believes they're actually going to hit this 1.2 million target. Yet, you know, they continue to gaslight us, saying they're going to do it. And even if they did, it's not going to be enough because they're growing the population by this. It's too much. And you can see it's too much. And the other thing is, even if we could magically hit the 1.2 million target, or we repeated what we did here, what's the quality going to be like? A lot of this was high-rise apartments. We all know how that turned out last decade. We had flammable cladding. We've had huge structural defects. You know, the Opal Tower, Mascot Tower, all those sorts of things. We've had reports of huge, you know, in Victoria, in Melbourne, we've had massive problems with balconies that are unsafe. We've had water leaks. The problem with it is if you try and build houses too quickly in order to keep up with this rampaging population growth, you're going to obviously, you know, compromise in quality, which is exactly what we did last decade when we did this. We had this huge high-rise construction boom. We built a whole lot of crap that was cladded in flammable cladding that, you know, has obviously suffered from a whole bunch of construction faults and has left a lot of people in a lot of trouble. Well, if we do this on steroids and try and do it again for 5 years, but do it at a higher level, and we rush it, we're obviously going to have worse quality again. And we're going to be left with more high-rise garbage. Like, we could avoid all this if we just simply lowered population growth to these kind of levels. We could actually take our time to build proper quality stuff. You know, it's not rocket science. None of this is rocket science. But, you know, we're not allowed to talk about it because if you talk about it, you're racist. And, you know, it's just ridiculous. Like, you know, the defenders of this stuff want to try and make you believe that running these immigration levels at these extreme levels, at the extreme levels we're doing, doesn't impact housing the market. Like, the housing market's all about supply. BS, it's about demand. Look at this. As I said, we had the highest supply ever in the nation's history last decade, and we still didn't build enough.